So I work for the Salvation Army International Heritage Centre, which is where we hold the archives of the Salvation Army in the UK and all around the world. So I'm speaking today from those sources that we hold in the archives. So all the images and all documents that are on the slides are from the archive that we have, which is in a different borough that I won't name. But I know the collections here and both in Tower Hamlets do include a lot of Salvation Army content, but this is very much our collection's view of that. So I'm going to say a bit about the origins of the Salvation Army generally, and then I'm going to look at Hackney specific, the evangelical outreach work, and then I'm going to look at the social work, which includes the maternity work that I think a lot of people in this room may be familiar with. And then I'm going to wrap up with a very quick look at Abney Park, although that's a big thing in itself. But to start off, I'm going to have to start with an apology. I'm talking about Salvation Army in Hackney. I'm going to start the talk not in Hackney, but 2 miles south, that way, in Whitechapel, which is obviously over the border into Tower Hamlets, because it was there in 1865 that the East London Christian Mission was founded. And this is William Booth preaching on Mile End Waste in July 1865, outside what's now the Blind Beggar pub. But at this time there was another pub called the Vine, which was actually built in the roadway on Mile End Waste. So that's what this image shows. Following this open air preaching, William Booth went on to hold a series of meetings in a tent just off in a park just off Mile End Road. So William Booth and his wife Catherine set up this new denomination and began to hold meetings after the tent fell down in a variety of unlikely venues all around Whitechapel. These included a dancing academy, a music hall, and even a former railway arch in Bethnal Green. The mission's first headquarters, the People's Mission Hall, opened in a former tavern on the Mile End Road in 1867. The East London Christian Mission quickly spread across London and beyond London. Louder. Okay, I'll try. If I go low, tell me again. Stay near the microphone. Okay. So the East London Christian Mission, 1865, starts in Whitechapel, spreads throughout London, and then it leaves London, opens a branch in Croydon, branch in Hastings, so the name has to change to simply the Christian Mission. And then in 1878, the name changed again, this time to the Salvation Army. And along with the name, the mission acquired a whole range of military nomenclature. So its chapels are now called corps, its ministers are called officers, its members are called soldiers, and William Booth is now General Booth. And you start seeing both members and clergy wear uniforms like this, and meeting halls, chapels are called corps, and they start being built in this kind of militaristic style. That's Wimbledon, I'm afraid. But it's very exemplary of the style of building. So, to come to Hackney. I've established already that the early years of the Salvation Army were very much based in Whitechapel around the Mile End Road. However, that's where the work was focused, but the Booth family didn't live in Whitechapel. When they first came to London in 1865, William and Catherine Booth and their 6 children moved into a house at 1 Cambridge Lodge Villas, which is near Victoria Park and is now the site of St Joseph's Hospice, if people know where that is. This is a house where their final 2 children were born. So when they moved 3 years later in 1868 to Gore Road, it was with 8 children, their domestic servants, and a whole menagerie of pets, which included cats, dogs, rats, mice, and even silkworms and guinea pigs, which apparently filled the garden of this quite big house on Gore Road. After more than a decade living in that house, the family moved to Stamford Hill to 114 Clapton Common, and then 5 years later made a very short move to Rookwood Road, opposite then as now the Stamford Hill bus garage. And this house had a blue plaque installed in 1962 to the Booth family having lived there. It was while living in this house, Rookwood Road, that Catherine Booth was diagnosed with a terminal cancer in 1888 at the age of 59. Because of that, the family had to move further out of London to Hadley Wood for Catherine's health. But she died in 1890 at Clacton-on-Sea, where she'd gone for her health. But William stayed in Hadley Wood for another 22 years before he died in 1912. And they're both buried in Abney Park Cemetery, which I'll come back to at the end. So while these various domestic moves and tragedies were being played out with the Booth family, the Salvation Army was expanding both within the UK and all around the world. So to go back in time to 1867, the 8th mission station, so chapel, of the Christian mission opened in Hackney, in a small shop on the corner of Hackney Road near Cambridge Heath Station. But the official beginning of the work in Hackney was 1870, when a Christian mission joined forces with the Wesleyan evangelist John Eason, who had already established his own mission with a hall in Lodges Road and a tent in London Fields. So these were now run collectively as the Christian mission. But the need for new and bigger premises, apart from the tent, were immediately apparent. And in 1875, the Christian mission opened this building, which was described as the most substantial hall that had then been built for the mission on Havelock Street near Wells Street Common. This substantial hall remained in use until it was destroyed in the Second World War. And by this time, the mission stations had adopted the name Corps as part of the Salvation Army's militaristic language, and Hackney Corps only remained open until the early years of the 20th century, when it closed. There were other venues acquired in the borough for evangelical use, including the Hackney Theatre on Glenarm Road in 1881 and College Lane Hall in 1883. But the most significant of these new acquisitions, and one of the most significant acquisitions the Salvation Army ever made, was the London Orphan Asylum, which had been built in 1828. The road in front of it is Lower Clapton Road, which obviously looks very different today. So the Salvation Army bought this in 1882. They reopened it as the Clapton Congress Hall. It was the largest building the Salvation Army owned in the world at the time, and it was their premier British meeting hall, with a central hall that could seat 4,500 people. And indeed, the term Congress Hall became used by the Salvation Army to refer to the biggest halls they opened in other big cities were called Congress Hall, in lineage with this building. It was also the site of huge international congresses from 1886, where Salvationists small across the world came to London and held a huge series of meetings in that building. As well as all this going on, it also housed the training college, where Salvation Army cadets were trained for ministry, and they'd be commissioned as officers at the end of a period of training. That transferred to the William Booth College in Camberwell in 1929, and the building itself was vacated completely in 1977. And it's mostly now demolished, but the portico at the front is still at the end of Linscott Road, just as it's part of a school now. The corps that had met in the Clapton Congress Hall at this point moves out and becomes Clapton Corps, Lower Clapton Road. And this new hall is built for it in 1975, which is one of the more sort of architecturally distinguished of Salvation Army halls, which tend to be quite vernacular. This is slightly more dramatic than a lot of them. We know about several other corps that opened in Hackney. Most of them now closed. There's a corps at Hackney Wick from 1906 to about the time of the First World War. There was a corps at Rossington Street in Upper Clapton from 1904 to 1963. There was a corps in Homerton, which opened in 1889, which has gone missing from my slide for some reason. And there's a fair chance that there's one or two other smaller corps that will have been in the borough at some point that I've not been able to properly identify. Apart from Clapton, there are two other Salvation Army corps that remain active in the borough. There's Cambridge Heath, which opened in Cambridge Heath in 1894, but it moved into Hackney on Mare Street in 1908. The hall it was in was also bombed in the Second World War, and this new hall opened in 1957, although it's been extended, obviously, since then. The core at Stoke Newington opened in 1870, so the same year as the Hackney core. It moved into a converted brewery in 1874. It closed in 1999, but it reopened about a decade ago, and it now has a cafe opposite Avenue Park Cemetery. But this rapid spread of the Salvation Army, with its vocal and musical open evangelism, did not go unopposed in Hackney, as it did elsewhere. While the main focus of violent opposition to Salvationists is found in resort towns on the south coast, such as Worthing and Torquay, there was a skeleton army formed in Hackney to oppose the Salvation Army, especially the public disturbance that was perceived to be caused by the Salvation Army's musical processions, which the Hackney and Kingsland Gazette described as a dismal and repulsive jargon of music and voice, sent forth in a pitiable discord. That was 1882. And there's a really good article by Ed Lyon in Hackney History from 2014 about all this, which is called, wonderfully, An Avalanche of Wrathful Violence, and includes a description of a skeleton army demonstration in Victoria Park in 1883, which ended in a riot through neighbouring streets and 3 convictions for disorderly conduct in Worship Street Police Court, and 1 conviction for assaulting a police officer. So I said previously, one second. The Clapton Congress Hall was where the Salvation Army trained its officers for ministry, which was 1882. But even before that, in 1881, a small training home was opened to train male Salvation Army cadets at 259 Mare Street. This home, once training moved to the Congress Hall, this building was then used as a prison gate home for receiving released prisoners. And then in 1887, the address became the base of the newly established Rescue Work headquarters. The Salvation Army had begun running rescue homes in Glasgow in 1883, and a rescue home is like a sort of women's refuge, women who have been in sex work or who've been in domestic circumstances that they want to leave, or just in a sort of difficult position could go and stay in the home for a period of time, and the Salvation Army would then help them find a job, find somewhere to live when they left the home. A second rescue home opened in Whitechapel in 1884, and by 1887 the Salvation Army had 5 rescue homes, and the headquarters was needed to coordinate the work that they were carrying out. And this was run by William and Catherine's daughter-in-law, Florence, who was, I think, 21 at this point. In 1910, the Rescue Work headquarters left this building and moved into a purpose-built building on 280 Mare Street. And by this point, it had become the Women's Social Work headquarters because the Rescue Work had expanded rapidly. And by this point, 1910, the Salvation Army had 53 institutions across the British Isles, which included hostels, children's homes, inebriates homes, and eventide homes for the elderly. Whereas Hackney had the greatest concentration of women's social work homes of anywhere in the country. No other London borough, no other city in the British Isles had as many institutions run by the women's social work as Hackney. And that's the whole rest of the talk. It's worth saying that these homes were all run for women, by women. There was a wholly separate men's social work headquarters in Whitechapel, and as far as I can tell, there were no men's social work institutions in Hackney at all. So it was just focused on the work with the women. The first of these institutions to open in Hackney was the rescue home that had opened in Whitechapel in 1884, which in August 1885 leaves Hanbury Street, Whitechapel, and opens at, 48 Navarino Road, which is about a 10-minute walk from here. I think this is the first of some quite complicated slides that I'm trying to explain a lot of different centres. So forgive me, I might repeat a lot of what's on the screen. So the rescue home had moved into 248 Navarino Road in 1885. By the end of that year, the 2 houses next door to 48 had also become rescue homes, numbers 46 and 44. The photograph here only shows 46 and 48. 48 is the other half of a semi on this side of the picture, but it's a very difficult site to photograph because it's on domestic street, so it's quite close to what you're photographing. However, these rescue homes had to move again fairly quickly because, according to one source, this is a quote, neighbours took exception to the singing and conspired to have the Salvation Army ejected by the end of 1888, which isn't the only opposition to the Salvation Army's musical displays, as we've already seen. So in each of these three homes, the three houses on Navarino Road, each moved to a different part of Hackney and had a different and new focus. London 1 home in Stamford Hill taught machine knitting. This home moved back to Clapton in 1901. London 2 in Clapton Square taught needlework, while London 3 at 183 Amherst Road specialised in making washable texts, which were wall hangings with quotes from the Bible or Salvation Army symbols on them. The purpose of these industries was to give the women in the home a trade when they left the home. So the knitting work is knitting machines. That's not sort of knitting needles. That's big industrial knitting processes. And then the income that was made from selling these products was put back into the running of the homes. So they were trying to aim for self-sufficiency. So each home would fund the work it was doing from the products it was selling rather than from Central Salvation Army funds. So that's the rescue work. The part of social work that I think is most associated with Hackney is the maternity work. And the Mothers' Hospital that opened in 1913 on Lower Clapton Road is the most famous example of that. However, the maternity work began 20 years before that building opened in Brent House on Devonshire Road, which is now called Brent House Road, confusingly, but at least you know where it is because the house has been demolished. The need for maternity work arose out of the rescue work, because the women who are coming into the rescue homes, either because they'd been in sex work or because they'd been a victim of various kinds of domestic abuse, would find themselves in the home and pregnant. So a need was identified almost immediately for there to be some sort of maternity function also being carried out. And Brent House, when it opened in 1988, was described as a home for hitherto well-conducted young women who have been led astray and are about to become mothers. It also functioned as the maternity hospital, so women would give birth in the home as well as living in the home up until the point of birth. In 1890, the maternity home function opened in Ivy House at 271 Mare Street, which was under the supervision of a Salvation Army minister who was also a trained midwife, Mrs. Captain Caroline Frost. The hospital trained its own student midwives from 1889, and 250 midwives graduated from that institution before the Mothers' Hospital opened in 1913. So at this point, Brent House is still open, and that's where the women who are in the rescue work system are living. And then when they have the baby, they go to Ivy House to have the baby, and that after a period of time, they return to Brent House to live there. So Ivy House is the first dedicated maternity home run by the Salvation Army, but others opened all across the UK in subsequent years in Cardiff, Belfast, Liverpool, Glasgow and other big cities. But the largest of them all was in Hackney, the Mothers' Hospital. In 1913, Ivy House closes and the Mothers' Hospital is opened by Princess Louise, who was the daughter of Queen Victoria. Now I should ask, because I get this a lot, was anyone here born in the Mothers' Hospital? Oh, that'll do. Good. You say like, yeah. Even I do talks.
My friends were nurses there.
Oh wow.
Malaysian nurses.
I do.
They were midwives there.
I'm coming on stage later on, so there are midwives in the talk. I promise you. Yeah, I do talks kind of a lot, and people say, "Oh, I was born in the Mothers' Hospital," even if I'm in like Glasgow or something. So, anyway, so 1913, Salvation Army purchases 3 19th century houses on Lower Clapton Road with the intention of demolishing them and building a purpose-built maternity hospital. As late as 1930, as you can see from this picture, there were still plans to build a purpose-built maternity hospital. But even now, 40 years after the hospital's closed, those three Victorian houses are still there on Lower Clapton Road. The Salvation Army built a lot more houses behind the frontage. A lot more hospital accommodation behind his houses. That's now demolished, and it's now Mothers Square, which is a modern housing development. Now I think my slide's in the wrong order here, so if you just bear with me. Yeah, that's the right one. So the new hospital continued to uphold the teaching tradition of Ivy House, and midwives were trained at the Mothers' Hospital to the standards of the London Obstetrical Society and the Central Midwives Board. District midwives also worked from the hospital and from Lawn House across the road, going out into the community to help women who were having children sort of all across the borough. New buildings on the site, including nurses' accommodation, were opened by Queen Mary in 1921, and she visited again in 1925 when she opened a new surgical block with an operating theatre, and that's a photograph of Queen Mary visiting in 1925. The hospital was designed to accommodate 600 births a year, but by 1930 there were 2,000 births a year happening at the hospital. And by the time it closed, after 73 years of operation, there had been a total of 124,000 live births that had taken place at the Mothers' Hospital. But in 1948, with the creation of the National Health Service, not the Hackney Health, the National Health Service, the hospital was administered as part of the Hackney Group of Hospitals. However, the Health Service agreed that a portion of the staff should always be Salvation Army officers or members, and the hospital was run as a joint project between the NHS and the Salvation Army. After 1948, it effectively became the general maternity hospital for Hackney, if not a large part of East London beyond Hackney. But it retained a specific ward for women from the Salvation Army's rescue homes, where they came to have their babies, and it retained the name Salvation Army on the elevation, as far as I'm aware, until it closed in 1986. And when it closed, all of the obstetric work at the hospital was transferred to the Homerton Hospital. So far, that's quite straightforward. So, as I was saying before with Brent House, women would come to have a baby at the Mothers' Hospital, but before they came to the hospital, they'd live in a Salvation Army home, and then after they had a baby, they'd return to the home they'd been in before. These homes start... No, that's fine. These homes start to proliferate as the Salvation Army's work expands in the 1890s and beyond. So there were four, they were called homes for mothers and infants. So these are the homes that the women live in before they go to the hospital to have a baby. There are four, but they move a lot. They change their names, they swap function. They're in the same building with a different name. And I spent a very long time trying to make this list. So they all start with Brent House from 1894. So the first home moves to Hope Lodge in Clapton Common in 1926, and then it moves to Sapler's House on Lower Clapton Road in the 1940s and closed in 1960. Then a second home opens in 1909, Lawn House in Stoke Newington, which is initially also a maternity hospital, and then the Mothers opens in 1930, and that just becomes a home for mothers with infants. Because of the demand, a wholly third actually, in this case, home is opened in Upper Clapton at Cotland, and that moves to Stamford Hill, and then it moves to Lanwick House, which is just opposite the Mothers Hospital, in 1967. And then, again, because of increased demand, a whole new home is opened in 1926, Cotland, which is also opposite the Mothers Hospital, and that moves out to Hackney Downs later that same year. So in these homes, women, the mothers, were expected to actively participate in the learning of domestic skills, such as cooking, sewing, craft skills, and skills around looking after a child. At times, all of these homes had midwives on the staff in case babies were born early or there wasn't space at another hospital for them to go into. Most of the births were happening at the Mothers' Hospital. So a second Lawn House, which is on the second bullet point, Lawn House 2, opens on Clapton Common in 1918. Both of these homes, Lawn 1 and Lawn House 2, were gifts from Princess Louise, the daughter of Queen Victoria, who had opened the Mothers' Hospital, and she also held the title of the Marchioness of Lawn, which is why they're called Lawn House. And then Lawn House 1 closes, so Lawn House 2 becomes Lawn House, and it's very, very confusing. But in 1923, Lawn House 2 moved to a 19th century house on Lower Clapton Road, over the road from the Mothers' Hospital. This is next door to the Clapton Core Hall that we saw earlier. It became the special treatment centre for venereal disease in the 1920s. And it was then briefly an approved school for girls. But in 1949, so after the NHS has begun running the Mothers Hospital, this home is acquired by the Mothers Hospital, and it's run as accommodation for nurses, a training centre for nurses, and a base for district midwives, which gives me an excuse to include a sort of obligatory picture of midwives on bicycles. Thank you. So just to kind of illustrate some of the complexity around this, I'm going to look at one building that the Salvation Army owned, 13 Laura Place. So this is on a little road which is directly opposite the Mothers Hospital. And the Salvation Army acquired it in 1896 as a nursery home. It was called Lanark House already, so the name came with the home. But over the next almost century, the home has 12 different functions. It changes name 4 times, changes name back to what the home was before. It's the knitting home four times while other homes move in and out of it. Cotswold, which is the 4th mother and infant's home that opens in this building in 1926. The name of the home becomes Cotswold. It's only there for 7 months, it moves out again, and this becomes Lanark House again. So this is the thing with Hackney, there's so many institutions in Hackney that the Salvation Army runs, and the names change all the time. You don't know where the addresses are. Just looking at one building kind of illustrates how complicated all of this is. But this building closed in 1980, and Salvation Army sold that. Mothers Hospital closes 3 years later, so this is very much the kind of wrapping up the maternity work that the Salvation Army was doing. So that's the maternity work. I'm going to have a quick look at some of the other social work that the Salvation Army was doing in the borough. Again, these are all women's institutions run by women. These are in date order, just for the sake of an order. There was a bookbinding factory opened in Mare Street in 1887, which is a similar model to the knitting home and the needlework home, that women in the rescue work homes would be learning a bookbinding trade, and also the sale of those products would go towards the running costs for the home. That home moved to Shoreditch in 1889. The Murray Road Laundry Home opened in 1891. The Salvation Army had 4 laundry homes across the UK. This is the first, and it was the only one that was in London. And again, it's the same model as the homes. The women in the home learn commercial laundry skills. It's commercially run, so the money from the home goes back into the running of the home, and the women leave the home with a skill. That home closed in 1912. The Salvation Army's inebriate home for women opened in Grove House in Upper Clapton in 1896. That had been a rescue home beforehand, so a kind of straightforward, normal rescue home. But as with maternity work, people were coming into the homes who clearly had alcohol and in some cases drug problems, laudanum principally. So the Salvation Army identifies the need to designate one of its homes as a specific home for inebriates, using the language of the time. That home moves to Hillsborough House in Rookwood Road, Stamford Hill, was 1901, and then that house moves again to Amherst Road, and it closes in 1923. A second inebriates home for gentlewomen opened in Camberwell, which I don't know if that says anything about, but yeah. One of the most kind of peculiar homes, if not home at all, was 52 Thistlethwaite Road, which was the headquarters and lodging house for the Salvation Army's pedlars, who were ministers, ordained Salvation Army ministers in women's social work, and they would travel around the whole country selling produce that was made in the rescue homes. So they were selling the knitted work, they were selling the bound books, selling the washing texts. There's an image down here that shows the work of one of the pedlars. That's in the 1920s. Somebody had a donkey and a cart in Walthamstow and used to kind of drive around in that selling things. And it's a way to raise money for the Salvation Army to put back into the running of the women's social work, but it's also an opportunity for evangelism. The Salvation Army pedlars, they're also called lollards, that I don't fully understand why there's a link between lollards and pedlars, but that's a different story. They would go into people's homes, women's homes, and they could talk to them as a woman in a uniform, so there's a kind of degree of kind of safety. They're not commercial travellers who are slightly dubious in this period. But their headquarters was on Thistlethwaite Road. Oh, I've been talking too much. Yeah, children's home. So again, young children start coming into rescue homes, girls under 14. So there seemed to be a need to open a children's home. So all of this is organic. You open one home and then you see people in that home and think, oh, well, they need a separate home. So the Nest opens in Upper Clapton in 1906. I've gone ahead of myself. Initially, it could accommodate 70 girls, although accommodation was expanded to include boys a few years later. In 1915, it opened a seaside annex in Ramsgate called the Haven, so that children could go from the Nest for a holiday at the seaside in the Haven in Ramsgate. And this home closed in 1934, but the Haven stayed open and then moved back into London about a decade later, about 50 years later. So there's kind of these networks of homes. That was in Sydenham until about 20 years ago. That children's home closed. And then last of all, St Oswald Young Women's Residence opened in Stamford Hill in 1947. These were a network of homes across the country which accommodated, it's described at the time as being young city workers living away from their homes, such as factory hands and beginners in industry. And we know that students, particularly foreign students, also stayed in these young women's residences as well. I've been talking a lot about the women's social work with its headquarters on Mare Street, and that's a very structured part of the Salvation Army. But the Salvation Army did a lot of different things. There was another part of the work which it began as the cellar, gutter and garret brigade in the 1880s. It was called slum work for a very long time, and it became goodwill in the 1960s. And then it was absorbed into the work of the Salvation Army's Corps in the 1990s. These centres are really hard to find anything out about. Their records generally don't survive, and we kind of rely on trying to piece together secondary sources for where they existed. I've found 3 in Hackney, but there will definitely be more. There was 17 Glenarm Road, was a lodging house for unmarried mothers in the 1890s. 5 Oswald Road, Clapton Park, was a slum nursing post, also in the 1890s. And the main slum post was the Haggerston Kingsland Road slum, which opened in 1918, and we've got these 3 addresses for it at Halcombe Street, Phillip Street and Clarissa Street. And it closed in the 1920s. I think it might not close in 28, that might be the last record we have of it in 28, and it probably carried on for another 30 or 40 years, but we just haven't been able to pinpoint that in our records. So I'm going to finish up by looking at Abney Park Cemetery, which, I could do an hour on Abney Park Cemetery, so I'm just going to do this very quickly. And Abney Park do tours about the Salvation Army graves there, so some of you may know a lot of this already, and there's other ways to find this out as well. I think it's well known that William and Catherine Booth are buried in Abney Park, along with some of their children and some of their kind of high-profile early Salvation Army lieutenants. I think it's less well known that the Salvation Army has 130 graves in Abney Park, all over the park, and they go from very senior officers to very junior officers to members of the Salvation Army to people who were helped in Salvation Army homes. There are some girls who died in the Nest Children's Home who are buried in Abney Park. There's another social institution that had a plot there that I can't remember what it was at the moment. And there are some people who are buried there who we don't know who they are. We've got records of who's buried there, and some of the people we can't work out why they're in the Salvation Army grave. But there's 130 of them, and if you walk through the cemetery, you can sort of glimpse Salvation Army crests receding into the undergrowth in the park. It was an obvious choice for Salvation Army burials because it was the main London cemetery for nonconformists, and Salvation Army grew out of Methodism, so it has that lineage. The first burials there were in the very late 1880s, but the first really high-profile burial is Catherine Booth, 1890. This rather kind of washed out, quite eerie photograph shows her. There's a lot of people. I don't know how easy that picture is to see. There's a lot of people around the grave. But it's a really foggy day, so that might just be fog, or it might be age. We don't know. Her coffin came from Salvation Army's headquarters in the City of London and processed up to Abney Park. And then in 1912, William Booth dies, and by this point the Salvation Army has expanded right across the world, and his funeral brings London to a standstill. People say it's like the funeral of a monarch. And his cortege winds its way through the city, past the Mansion House, Bank of England. There's film of it on the internet, which you can watch. There's a lot of social bands in the film, and this is a picture of his coffin entering Avenue Park through the main gates. So, as I began the talk, talking about the Booth family coming to live in Hackney in 1865 before moving out to Hadley Wood, I'm ending the talk here with them being reunited together, both in Avenue Park. Thank you very much. Are there any questions, comments, observations? Anything you didn't hear that I might say again?
I have a great uncle or something who had the misfortune to be born out of wedlock, and it's a long story, but ended up in Barnardo's. And it was quite disgraceful the way, once he got to the age of being sent off on a boat, he was sent to sea and nearly died twice, and eventually met his eventual wife, and they now have descendants happily getting on very well over in Canada. But it was appalling the way people coming out of these homes, and we know till recent times, were treated. Was the Salvation Army, did they just sort of dump these kids into work, or did they look after them rather better once they started running orphanages and that sort of thing?
I think it's, I've got a colleague who works a lot on our social work records, and we get a lot of people contacting us who were either themselves born in a Salvation Army home or in a children's home, or they've got an ancestor who was in those places, or kind of their own parents. So he's done a lot of work looking at the different homes and statistics, and it's actually surprising how many babies stayed with their mothers. In most of the homes that you look at through, kind of in the early 20th century we're talking about here, things change over time obviously. Most of the babies born in the maternity homes go home with their mothers. We don't know what happens then, obviously, kind of. So the Salvation Army was also an adoption agency till the 1950s. So they were arranging adoptions for the children as well, although mainly that wasn't children born in the homes. That was mainly adoptions being done for children who were kind of in the wider community. I think there's a lot of variety, and the cultural norms change, and kind of one set of army homes might have worked in one way, and then other homes in other parts of the UK might have had different practices. One of the ideas behind the sort of industries that were running the homes, bookbinding, needlework, was to give women a trade. But it was also, because the Salvation Army kind of then identified either workplaces or people who would take women for domestic service from the homes, and then they'd give them a reference, so they could then get another job, and you've then disguised the fact that you're in a rescue home, because you've got a reference from another industry or employer. So they were thinking about what happened to people after they left the homes. In some cases in a way that was obviously Victorian and that wouldn't be what people did now. And some of the records that we have of the women in the homes, they can keep in touch with them for up to kind of a decade after they've left the home, trying to find out where they're living, what they're doing, are they married, are they kind of in danger of backsliding, is the term that was being used. There we go. Thank you.
Did the Salvation Army try to take over the Eagle in City Road? Up there.
Yes.
Why were they unsuccessful?
This is quite a story.
It's a club.
I don't know Hackney that well, so for this talk I've been a bit sort of, where do I stop? What are my boundaries? Is Dalston Hackney? But I thought Shoreditch is clearly out of, I'm not looking at Shoreditch at all, partly because the whole Eagle and Grecian story is so kind of huge that I couldn't kind of fit it in. I don't know if people know this story particularly, but the Eagle Tavern on Shepherdess Walk in Shoreditch was, by all accounts, the most disreputable pub in London in the 1880s. The song Pop Goes the Weasel has got a line in about going in and out of the Eagle. That's how bad it was. It opened a theatre called the Grecian as part of the site, so it's the Eagle and the Grecian. And some people had a great time there, but other people saw it as a kind of moral sink, and this sort of, and the Salvation Army bought it in 1882 when they were buying everything. London Orphan Asylum, they bought a roller skating rink on Regent Street. I don't know where the money came from in 1882. And there was a riot outside the Eagle on opening night because a lot of local people didn't want the Salvation Army to, because the Salvation Army is a temperance organisation, Salvationists don't drink. They kind of spent over a century campaigning against alcohol and trying to find ways to kind of limit alcohol consumption. So buying a pub is a very direct way of that. Buy the pub, no more alcohol. So it's a riot. The problem was that the lease on the pub included a requirement to serve intoxicating liquor on the premises. So William Booth, as a proprietor, was legally obliged to sell alcohol in the Eagle, which he wouldn't do because he was a temperance campaigner, but he had to do it because he'd bought the license. And there's a story that they had a bar upstairs in like a back room that no one ever went into. But the idea was that if someone asked for where's the alcohol, they're like, it's here in this bar. That might not be true. But I think they only held meetings in the Eagle for about 5 or 6 years, and then they leased it out. But as a pub, they owned a lease for about another decade. So the Salvation Army owned a licensed pub for about 10 years because they couldn't not. So thank you for the question. And yeah, that's a Shoreditch History Festival next year. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, do you have any records of Malaysian nurses in midwives in the Mother's Hospital in the late 70s and 80s?
We don't, because archivally the Mother's Hospital is quite complicated. Because after 48, because it's run with the NHS, there's a split in records between what we hold. Sorry,
The screen's gone.
oh, the screen's gone again. So, yeah, the records of the NHS part are held by St Bart's NHS Trust, which is in Whitechapel, I think. So they would hold the records of the staff. So we have some records, but they have other records. So we work with them quite closely. But if you have I
meant to do a talk later, 2 o'clock. And one of the nurses, my guest speaker,
yes.
actually worked here.
Oh, right.
This hospital. So
Yes.
you guys got questions about, someone was asking what happened to the baby.
Yes.
She might be able to talk. I mean, we all came in the end of 72, and we went to all sorts of hospitals. But I
Yes.
also did come there as a nurse, but I didn't come to Hackney to do nursing, but they did.
I think, and we do know of, because it was a teaching hospital, there were quite a lot of international midwives came to train there. So yes, thank you.
Oh yes, the Salvation Army Citadel in Mare Street is right next door to St Joseph's Hospice. Is there any connection between the two organisations?
Is that Cambridge Heath Citadel?
Yes.
I don't believe there is.
It's nearer to, as you're going up towards Wells Street, going north towards Wells Street on the right-hand side.
They're not connected institutionally.
No, that's my understanding, is that the hospice is Catholic and the Salvation Army. I think that's it. I mean, there's a lot of Salvation Army on Mare Street. Sort of historically, there's a lot of Salvation on Mare Street, but even now there's a few things still there. But no, I don't think there's a connection. Whether that was the site of the Booths' first house in Hackney. So.
How did the Salvation Army fund its activities? You talk about the Lord House and you talk about peddlers.
Yes.
But the investment in buildings must have been pretty enormous. Where did the funding come
No,
from?
that's a good question, and one that I don't have an easy answer to, but I'll give it a go. Yeah, 1882 is this year where they buy all this huge property, and William Booth's told he can't spend any more money, but he just keeps buying stuff, and then it pays for itself in the end, probably. I mean, initially, William Booth has got some very wealthy supporters. He himself isn't wealthy. He's from a fairly modest family in Nottingham. So he's not a philanthropist in any sense, but he was a Methodist independent preacher travelling around Britain for about 15 years before he sets up Salvation Army. And in that time he meets a number of people, mainly John Corey, who's a Welsh railway magnate, and Jonathan Billups, who's also lived in Cardiff. And they're evangelical Wesleyans, and they want to support they believe that Booth's doing the right thing evangelically, so they're very happy to support him. John Coy gives them a boat, and they start the Salvation Navy, but that's a different talk. And also, I mean, the idea for the social centres was that they would be self-funding, that they would get donations from former residents, they'd sell their own produce. I think only one home ever became actually self-funding, which was Clock House in Walthamstow, the one that had the peddler on the donkey. That covered its own costs from the home itself. But, you know, huge international expansion, a lot of money.
You did, thanks for the talk, it's been really interesting.
Thank you very much.
You were talking a lot about the social work for women who are disadvantaged, but I've also read that the sort of ordinary members, female members of the Salvation Army in the East End, it's sort of something that encourages them to look beyond, you know, to be more ambitious, to speak up. Is there much evidence of that in research?
Well, the Salvation Army is the first church in Britain to ordain women. So 1865, right from the start, women can be clergy alongside men. And there's no other church in Britain at that time where that was possible. The Quakers would allow women to preach, but the Quakers don't have official clergy. So the only women who could be ordained in Britain were Salvation Army women. And they had a uniform they wore, so very distinctive. They had a kind of authority in the public sphere. That as a Salvation Army member or officer dressed in uniform, you could go to places that a single woman couldn't in the Victorian period. And so there is this really strong tradition of female equality and encouraging women to take kind of leadership roles both within the Salvation Army corps, but also kind of independently within the community. And Catherine Booth herself is the leader on that. William initially isn't that set on having female preachers, but Catherine is absolutely set on it. She wrote a pamphlet in the 1850s defending women's right to preach the gospel, which was impossibly controversial. So yeah, absolutely.
Hiya.
Hello.
I've been in contact with you, so you may know this anyway.
Good, that's what I like to hear. Please contact us. Anyone's got any questions, send me an email.
I do tours at Abbey.
Oh yes.
How closely do you work with them on the graves? Because I'm thinking specifically of Rebecca Jarrett.
Yes.
I think there was some plan to actually...
Again, I left her out because that's just too...
I know.
I had all the notes, but it's too big a story. No, I'm thinking I might go and try and find her after this.
That's different.
I've got a map. We do a bit. Because we've got a new sign in Hackney Park for the Salvation Army, which is very exciting, which we collaborated with them on the text for that. The Booth family graves are, I think, owned by the international headquarters of the Salvation Army, so they're responsible for the upkeep of those graves. And I've had some contact with the Stoke Newington Corps, who are interested in the graves in Hackney Park, but it's something that I really want to develop. I think it'd be good to. We were looking at getting Rebecca Jarrett's grave repaired because it's in a terrible condition. Rebecca Jarrett really quickly was a former sex worker who was rescued through the Rescue Home Network in Northampton, not Hackney. And then she's used as a part of a campaign in 1885 where the Salvation Army tried to raise the age of consent to 16, which is successful. It's a huge high-profile campaign. There's some controversial tactics involved, and Rebecca Jarrett goes to prison for 6 months. And when she's released, she lives on Mare Street in the Salvation Army headquarters until she dies in the 1920s. And she's buried in Hackney Park. And her grave subsided, so you can't actually see her name on it. So we're quite keen to get that back.
There was the woman who founded the rescue homes, Elizabeth Cottrell.
Yes.
We were
Oh yes.
responding about that.
Yes. Because
Yeah, she got married quite
absolutely, yes.
under a different name.
And we had no idea about this.
No.
This is so, yeah, no, that was, thank you for that.
She's in a common grave and it's not going to be there. So we possibly might want to look at getting some sort of memorial for her.
Definitely, yes. Yeah, I think totally. We can talk about it. Yeah, absolutely take this forward.
Great thing.
We've got a few minutes left, so was there... At the back?
I'm interested in the building that was opposite the town, well, the building's still there, opposite the town hall in Mersey. It's quite a major Salvation Army building there next to the old Methodist Central Hall. I just wondered what the history and function of that was. There's still a stone enclave outside.
Is that this one? Yeah, that was the Women's Social Work Headquarters. Women's Social Work Headquarters. It was built in 1910 as a purpose-built kind of office space to coordinate all of the 50-plus social centres that were all over the country. And yeah, there's not a lot of the buildings that are left, so it's quite nice that that building is still there. It's now a commercial office space. So that's the photograph of it recently. It's been refurbished recently. I think we've got maybe one more question. Yeah.
I'm assuming that the state was doing virtually nothing for these people who were very impoverished. So have you just got any sense of, although there was middle class opposition, that the ordinary person in the street, from the way that they turned out to Booth's funeral in 1912, was it really honestly a massive difference to everybody at grassroots level? And what do you think inspired the work that they did?
I think there's a lot of working class opposition to the Salvation Army, particularly to its kind of to the not drinking, to the very noisy public display. And there's a huge debate sort of historically still about where the Salvation Army falls in class terms, about because the Salvation Army at the time claimed a lot of working class support or a kind of underclass or submerged tent support. But some people say if you look at the records, it's actually more like middle class Methodists who are coming to the meetings. And it honestly isn't clear. And William Booth's funeral is attended by international heads of state, it's attended by the Mayor of London, and there's not really a sense of all these people turning out because they're supporting William Booth, or other people lining the streets there because it's something to do. And I mean, the motivating factor for all of this is evangelical Christian belief, that there's an idea that you can't save someone's soul if their body is, if they have physical problems, if they have health problems, if they have domestic problems, they're not going to be thinking about their salvation. And that underpins all of this work. Thank you very much.